Cheryl Peretz, Associate Dean of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies here at American Jewish University in Los Angeles. And today I'm really delighted to welcome Ariel Nishli, who is a producer and founder of Sarah Pictures. Ariel started his career at ICM Partners and moved into feature film development at Parks and McDonald Productions before serving as editor-in-chief at Coldcast TV. Ariel brought his love for the unfolding Jewish story and digital media together as executive director of Chosen, that for a good amount of time was housed at American Jewish University. And we were just talking about how we shared a wall of our office. And the series tonight that we're going to talk about that Ariel wrote and produced was a collaborative project between his company, him personally, and Open Door Media. And we're just delighted that you're here, and thank you for making the time, Ariel. And it's nice for me to get to see you again.
Thank you. It's really good to be back with AJU. I have many fond memories of my 5 years there, and that's right. We did share an office wall, and as we said, we often didn't see each other for weeks, but we shared the same space. And anyway, it's a nice reunion, and I'm so glad that all of this unfolded in the way it did to bring us back together and talk about another part of the Jewish story.
Excellent. We did share, and I know it'll be shared again, the link to the series of videos on Zionism that you wrote and produced. But I wonder if you could just briefly tell the crowd a little bit about the project, what it meant to you, and for whom it was intended.
Sure. So the Israeli-Palestinian context is it's just that what we realized, what Open Door realized, and then what I quickly understood myself is that, especially in the last 3 to 5 years, the way that anyone seems to be talking about this ongoing conflict is through heated rhetoric and through lack of dialogue and just talking points. And what we found is that, or maybe, I could say the thesis was that if we could couch the series in some context, historical context, in the context of the current conversation, which in my mind was identity politics and a lack of more nuanced history, nuanced historical understanding, then that might create a dialogue. And so really there were two main threads when it came to developing the series. And the first thread was couching each episode, and anyone who goes on the YouTube page will see it's very clearly packaged this way, couching each episode in a certain assumption made about Israel, whether it's about being an occupying power, an apartheid state, or what Zionism really was about, being progressive and being Zionist, and Israeli identity. So each episode really is formed around this question that people seem to be answering in many different ways online, and you could just pick which answer you want depending on what you search. And so that was one thread. And the other thread, which created really the dynamic challenge in developing the series, was let's do it linearly, let's do it historically. So then the challenge from a developmental standpoint became, how do you create 6 episodes, and it was at one point it was 8 episodes and 4 episodes, we ended up with 6 episodes that each handle one big idea, one high concept about the whole conflict, and then how do we do that within appropriate historical context, where if you watch it from 1 to 6, you're getting history from the late 19th century to the present day, as well as watching it, ad hoc. You can answer one big question, like, did Israel expel Palestinians? Is Israel an occupying power? And you can really get a better understanding. And so the whole goal with those 2 threads was designed to do one simple thing, which we can explore if we've achieved that, which is to give people a primer on this conflict, for people who really don't have a more sophisticated, nuanced understanding of both sides of the issue, or of the whole issue historically. Can we give them a tool, a resource that at least allows them to jump in a responsible way, in a comprehensive way, and then from there they can do more research rather than finding, again, a lot of heated rhetoric, a lot of propaganda in many cases, and just not getting more of the full picture.
So I'm actually going to ask you to just expand on that a little bit, and this may sound like an impossible question, but I'm wondering if you could just tell us in a couple of sentences, what is like, what is it you wanted us to hear? What's the two-sentence understanding of the conflict? I know that's impossible, but what is it about the conflict that you wanted your viewers to actually feel, think, understand?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's a hard question, but I think I come at the question sideways a little bit because for me, and I speak for myself, growing up, and I think I speak for a lot of people in maybe the generation younger than me too. I think that Israel is only seen through the lens of the conflict, and I think that's a big problem, especially for young Jews, for Jewish Americans. It's it's as if there's this ongoing war in some corner of the Middle East, and there happen to be some Jews there, and there are Palestinians there, and it's just this big problem that they keep hearing about. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to step back from that, actually, and I wanted to look at Israel's history as a whole. I wanted to look at the history of Palestinian Arabs as a whole, and I wanted to ask how these two histories, how these two peoples, how these two identities and these shared visions of the land and these shared pasts came together in oftentimes a really tragic way, but in almost an impossible way. And so for me, I saw my role in a way. I grew up in the States. I was born in the States. My parents are Israeli. My whole family is Israeli. So yeah, I've talked about this before. My family is literally there. I have 17 first cousins and all their kids there. I have one set of cousins in Wisconsin. My wife's family is mostly in Dallas, but much of my identity is Israeli. And so for me, growing up, I could hardly think about Israel as some sort of abstract political a movement or idea that came to fruition. I thought about it as where my cousins lived, and it's where I got put on the phone to say hi to my grandmother, on Erev Shabbat. So for me, what struck me was that I found that, especially online, you see Jewish kids and young Jewish adults talking about Israel as if there's like zero emotional connection to the state. And to me, that was so odd, because for me, Israel is family. Israelis are family. I think that, all the Jewish people are family. And so I wanted to, in a way, say to the viewer, and what I think we tried to do is going way back to Israel's ancient roots in the regions to today and through Israel's modern political history. I wanted to sort of couch it in this idea that, there's something to relate to there that is that it should really transcend just the politics, to transcend this conflict. And it's really important for your own Jewish identity and your own Jewish understanding to relate to this place and to the people there as in some sense an extended family. And so in a way, I wanted to create that sort of feeling and to create that sort of history, which I think is fairly easy to create if you look at the history of the Jewish people and its relationship to, proto-Zionism and modern Zionism, and in a way, ancient Zionism. The land is so tied to Jewish identity that that's not a hard thing to do. It's actually all there. It's just that not a lot of people really look at it that way. And so I tried to start from that place. And so I saw my role as a sort of, like your uncle who wanted to reintroduce you to your, to your grandma or your cousin who's in Israel, and to try to get you to understand their history. And then from there to understand how this conflict evolved. So that was very important to me.
Great. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about who the audience is for this, and how you think the series can contribute to a more substantive conversation in that audience. And then one of our attendees has a great question, which is, are Palestinians included in that audience, or is there a different film series for them?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the audience here was mainly American college students, high school students, and international audience too, but also anybody of any faith, of any background, of any ethnicity or identity that is just curious about the conflict. And so in trying to appeal to somewhat of a Gen Z audience, as well as an audience that might just be curious about it, we wanted to really try to come at the conflict from its most salient points, right? Like the hot button topics of occupation and apartheid and identity, and can you be progressive and be a supporter of the Jewish state. We wanted to to address these things and unpack them. It's actually on the YouTube channel is called Unpacked, it's part of Open Door, and that's really their MO is they take really complex issues and they try to unpack them. And to do that, we felt like that would be the best way to reach that kind of audience that again is really is often subjected to more rhetoric and propaganda. And as far as the question was, can you repeat the question from the audience member?
The audience, it was, are Palestinians included in the audience, or is there a different video series for them?
No, it's such a great question. There's so much in that question. So the simple answer is yes, absolutely. Why? Palestinians are included because for me, if a Palestinian person does not, I don't know, Palestinians are not one homogenous group, right? There's many different, people out there. But essentially, if it doesn't sort of meet the criteria of the generally accepted Palestinian narrative, then I feel like the series maybe fails, right? Because our job is we were threading a very fine needle, and that fine needle, we were threading a very fine point with a very fine needle, which is how do we come from a unabashedly Zionist place? Israel has the right to exist. Israel is a good place. Israel is a work in progress, and how do we do that while also acknowledging that there's been a really tragic history between these two peoples, and that both sides were put in an impossible situation. And in order to do that, we had to create a narrative that addresses both sides fairly. And so yes, I think Palestinians should watch it, could share it, and could comment on it if anything is found problematic, and open up that discussion, which is really the point of all content, of all media, especially maybe of a political nature. And I think that I'll sort of take the question to another level too, which is that how much of Israeli history, how much of Palestinian history, let's call it from the mid 19th century or the late 19th century until today, can you tell in 6-8 minutes episodes, right? So we very quickly realized as we were whittling down our scripts that it's on one level you have to pick and choose what parts to leave out. You can't tell it all. It's impossible. Nobody would watch. And even if they would, I don't know how helpful that would be. So you have to make those choices creatively. And then when you figure out what you want to keep in there, obviously you have to look at it from a certain lens. And that's the lens that I described, a Zionist lens that acknowledges, the other side. And I don't even like to look at it as the other side necessarily. I like to look at it as, the whole picture. So please share with your Palestinian friends. Absolutely.
Is there any attempts to work with any Palestinian organizations to share the video that you know of? To share the video?
Yeah, I think Open Door is doing that. They have a marketing team that is taking this series, even actually this fall. My understanding is that it's going to Jewish day schools around the country as well as a resource. And they have excuse me, they have different partnerships with organizations in Israel. They have an office in Israel. And I think that a big part of that is Israeli-Palestinian dialogue. I don't know of any specific initiatives, initiatives out there. But when we were developing the series, that was something that came up a lot is, how do we get this in the hands of campus groups and so to speak, pro-Palestinian groups or, activist groups like that who actually want to hear how Israelis and Jews talk about this conflict. So if there is a specific initiative, I'll share it with the group.
Great. I'm glad that you mentioned about the day school groups and other places that it's being used to teach. How you use the film series to educate in a campus context where the discourse is around genocide and ethnic cleansing. And I know you mentioned that a little bit earlier, but I'm just wondering if you have any information on how it is being used and how educators are using it and advancing that conversation to make it as impactful as possible and not just here, watch these 6 videos.
Yeah, it's a good question. So look, on campus especially, the words that get people fired up are, like you said, genocide and ethnic cleansing and an occupation and all these kinds of very, you know, emotive words. Um, my understanding is what Open Door has done. They've created a curriculum around this show, and their MO as a studio and as an educational institution is to create nuance around topics that lend themselves very quickly to polarizing ideologies and points of view. And so my understanding is that they take each of these 6 episodes, they actually create a curriculum around each. And that is a first step to go beyond the 8 minutes and to look at what was the nature, for example, of in episode 2, we asked the question, was Zionism a form of colonialism? So in a classroom setting, in a college, you know, freshman seminar, or even in a high school history class, if a professor or teacher were to, in my opinion, do, you know, a more, you know, responsible and sort of nuanced approach in teaching this issue, they would ask what was happening around the world in that time in terms of colonialism and imperialism, and how were those words being used, and were the political Zionists at that time, were they truly trying to colonize a place in the same way that other European powers were, or was it really a group of scattered Jews across different countries and continents who had a shared vision that was actually ancient and that actually crystallized into political form? And I'm just using this as one example. Why? Because colonialism is such a, you know, colonialism is bad, and we have, you know, if as soon as anything, you know, reeks of it, we want to run away. We don't want to associate with it. But, you know, you look at some of these old speeches and these documents that I think Herzl himself used the word, and if you dig a little bit, you realize that he didn't use the word in any of the same context that it's used today, or that it was used historically by, or that it was practiced historically by those countries, those European nations. He used it to mean something very different, which is a people building up their ancient homeland that they have a right to return to. And so what often happens is people will literally take the word from a speech like that, and they'll use it in the context of imperialism, where you're taking one ethnicity and sticking it on someone's land and exploiting those people, and they'll just create a narrative that is, there are seeds there's kernels of truth, but it's really not by any stretch of the imagination the whole picture. And so that's one example of that period of time. And I think, you know, if the question was how do educators really use this series as a resource, is, you know, you get a curriculum, you show the videos, which again, it's like every minute of these videos is like 40 Google searches you could do to go down the rabbit holes of all the nuanced history. But with, like, you know, maybe with a 15-page document, which I think is what they've created, something along those lines, with each video, you now have a way to hit the most salient issues and understand the context again historically. And that way, what it does, I think, and this is really the goal of the series, we'll say for college kids or for high school kids especially, is it gives people a chance to, let's say theoretically, you're walking through the quad and there's an SJP protest going on, and you're curious, you're Jewish, you want to check it out, you're like, hey, I'm cool, and I'm liberal, and I love everyone, and I just, why you guys and girls so adamant about Israel being so evil? And then when you're hit with these points, the goal is, if you've seen this series and if you've read up a little bit about it, you can say, wait a minute, but there's another side to that story. You know, there was colonialism, then there was Zionism, which the two can't be the same. You could speak to that point and then open up the dialogue. And if you talk about, even in 48, you know, like 750 Palestinians were expelled, but there's a context there. There's such a context there in terms of the war that was going on, the existential crisis, the Mizrahi, you know, population, 850,000 that came from, you know, all the Arab countries into Israel. And there's so much to explore there. And I don't know that many people have those sort of second layer of conversation to add. I think they hear Israel is genocidal, Israel is white and European and aggressive and militaristic. And if you don't know any better and you're a young liberal Jewish freshman college student who just wants to sort of get through their day and not get caught up in like, geopolitics and crises like that, but you have a sense of Jewish pride, you have a sense, even just a seed of Zionism in you, it could be very difficult to withstand all that social pressure. And so the hope is that a series like this is like a pithy way to give people just a tool and a resource to take the conversation to the next level, because you need information to do that. It's not just passion or confidence. You need to have some facts.
I'm wondering if you could tell us, in the making of the movie, if there were any particular stories or interactions between Israelis and Palestinians that you encountered that that reinforce this nuanced and different understanding that you're talking about, that's counterintuitive to what we hear about the national dilemma and the national conflict.
Yeah, there's a sort of tangential one. So I reached out to you guys. People might know an activist named Rudy Rothman. He's an Israeli American who puts out these YouTube videos, and we talked about potentially doing an episode together. It ultimately didn't work out, but what he put out right before the series came out, and which was a big topic of conversation for us, is he organized a roundtable between him and I think 2 or 3 young Israelis and 2 or 3 young Palestinians, and they did this hour-long conversation about all of the history. It's on YouTube, on his YouTube page, and it was fascinating because it was like an exercise in healthy conversation and in breaking down barriers. The first 20 minutes were very heated, and then when everyone kind of doubled down on the idea that they're there to learn from each other, people kind of bit their tongues, they listened to one another, and they explained their side of the history, and then before you knew it, by the end, it seemed that when everyone's guard was down, there was really this earnest desire to just figure out a better future. And that is one thing that, in our last episode, in episode 6, I think we touch on, is that we spoke to a young Israeli guy, Itzik Erkoni, and he's also worked with many Palestinians in his career. He did a lot of Israel advocacy and dialogue programming, and we just see that people are entrenched in the narratives, which is okay because it's their people's story, but there is an earnest desire, especially among younger people, when they feel not threatened, to transcend that and to talk to the other side and to try to envision a better future. I think that's something that that can continue with dialogue like that. So this series was not a Israeli-Palestinian dialogue. This series was a Zionist approach to understanding Israeli history from a nuanced perspective.
How does this series deal with the settlements of Israelis on Palestinian land, the encroachment and constant enlarging of Israeli land, as well as Jerusalem and the encroachment of that, the history of Israeli settlements in the West Bank? How in the thinking of this movie and in the thinking of wanting to share this, how we tell the story of thinking of sharing our historical homeland with Arabs when they have never wavered one iota. So I know you're not a politician. I'm not asking you to be one, but I just wonder if you can comment on any part of that from either direction that might resonate.
Sure. So I think the short answer is we're not trying to give a verdict on anything that's going on. That was never a goal of any episode or of the series as a whole, is to pass some sort of judgment on the settlements or on Arab intransigency and anything like that. What we've done with both issues, actually, in episodes 4 and 5, what we did was we tried to lay out as clearly as possible, without oversimplifying, how we got to where we are today. So in other words, when you look at the years between 48 in 67 and you look at the situation that both people were in post 67, how do you end up with Israeli military in the West Bank? How do you end up with Jews settling Judea and Samaria? And why do you have a difference of opinion in Israeli society itself about the military and religious Zionists being in those places? And how did the Arabs respond? And we touched on all that. And we also then, went a step further with the Oslo Accords, and we tried to break down, again, it's an impossible thing to break down so simply, but the different areas of the West Bank, the different levels of governance, who's in charge of security, who's in charge of administration on either side. And we tried to explain how all these things came to pass without hitting blame, without trying to explain away, one side of the aisle or the other. And so in that way, I think the viewer can say, oh, settlements, that doesn't sound so kosher to me. I'm going to go look that up, because now and they're going to get from this series a little bit of both sides and understanding how a settlement came to exist. And then as far as, the Arab, leadership's unwillingness to give up land throughout the peace process, they'll understand what the mindset was among Arab leaders and among the Arab population, which arguably was different historically in many ways. And they'll be able to look that up too. And so for me, again, I'm the guy, the circus is in town where we have all these interesting exhibits about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I'm out front, I'm sitting on a stool and I'm saying, hey, you got to check this tent out, go in there, check that out. There's something for everyone here about the, from 1890 to 2020, we're going to give you an overview. And then I want people to watch and then to start Googling, to start exploring, to start commenting, because we're not going to give you the whole picture, but it's a way in if you don't know where to start.
So you had, these videos, each one 6 to 8 minutes, and you wanted to tell a story, I think an overarching story, but also an independent story in each one. If you had to pick like one scene, one piece of one of the episodes that you think is the most important, and you get bonus points if you can identify which episode, so people can go watch it as soon as we finish this.
Sure.
What would that be and why? Like what the essential message of the videos?
Yeah, that's a good one. You're making me choose between my children. No, it's okay. I think actually, if I could cheat, I'll pick two small segments. I'll pick a segment from the first episode. I'll pick a segment from the last episode. In the first episode, and I'll talk to our, I'll speak to the interviewees. So each episode, just to contextualize the answer to the question, each episode featured an individual who ostensibly has nothing to do with the topic at hand, right? We picked college activists, we picked people working in the field, and we picked people from diverse backgrounds to talk about their understanding of the conflict and the history. And so in the first episode, you have a guy named Ben Freeman, and he's a teacher, and he lives, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Ben, don't get angry at me, I think he lives right now in Scotland, and he's teaching at a university in Scotland. And he's a gay man who has coined essentially what's called the Jewish Pride movement. And what he found is that, and I think a lot of people found this, but he crystallized it into a book, and he crystallized it into a message, and he's featured in the first episode. And he found that it's been very convenient with the way the social currents are swirling in the last year or two to couch the conflict, what is really a geopolitical conflict between two peoples with shared histories, into identity politics, into an LGBTQ issue, into a race issue, into an economic issue. And what he does in this first episode is he says, look at me, I don't fit the bill by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not Israeli, I'm not American, I'm a foreign national, and I have this idea of what this conflict is from a historical standpoint and what it's not. And he also is in very liberal circles. Same thing with Blake Clayton, who is our guest interview in the second episode. And so there's this moment where he talks about his journey experiencing anti-Semitism when he was a college kid. And this is a guy that like is totally swimming in the liberal circles that are, that he identifies with. And he started experiencing really rampant anti-Semitism, but it was couched in anti-Zionism. And what he found, which is what a lot of people find, is that it's a very fine line. And if you don't understand how to criticize a nation's policies without, the Jewish guy in Borough Park, like, that can quickly turn into something very confusing and very ugly. And he was a victim of this. And so there's a moment towards the end of the first episode. 5 minutes in, but you should watch from the beginning for context, where he talks about his journey and how a light bulb went off and he realized this conflict has nothing to do with, with any of these identity politics. This conflict is something else completely. And the quicker people realize that, the quicker they'll, start to get a clear understanding of it. So that's one moment that really stuck out to me. And it's not really about history so much as identity. And then I'll say real quick, because I know I kind of have rambled on with that answer, is for the last episode, which is Who Are Israelis Really? Our other interviewee, Itzik Yarkoni, he talks about how the most used colloquial term in Israel is achi, which is brother. And people call each other brother all the time. Hey, achi, ma nishma, achi. It's like, it doesn't matter if like it's he says it's your plumber, or it's a guy you're getting groceries from, or your friend, or whoever it is, a coworker. And he says because there is a feeling of brotherhood there, and that transcends the people's backgrounds. And so Israel is full of many different backgrounds, Ashkenazim, Mizrahim, and Sephardim, and and et cetera, Russians and Ethiopians, and he talks about how there's a sense of brotherhood no matter what your background is, and he just captures the spirit perfectly. So that's episode 6.
Okay, so everybody can go look at those 2 episodes. What I want to ask you is, it's a 2-part question. What makes this project different or unique amongst those that tell the story of the conflict? And the flip side of that question is how you respond to those who might label it as just another attempt at, this time, Israeli propaganda as opposed to Palestinian propaganda. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that uniqueness and how you respond to the claim that it's just another aspect of propaganda.
Yeah. All right, I'll answer the propaganda question first. And I have a two-part answer to that question. The more the less polished answer is as follows. There's so much anti-Israel propaganda out there, like an overwhelming amount of anti-Israel propaganda that's doing so much damage to young hearts and minds that we could use a little, Israel propaganda. That's what I'll say. And I take it with a grain of salt, but in other words, if we're defining Israel propaganda, which is, I'll define it the way I like to think about it, as advocacy, as advocacy videos, as telling the Jewish story from a very proud point of view, from a very historically an unashamed historical point of view, to understand Zionism as a product of horrific pogroms, to understand, Ben Gurion reading Israel's declaration 3 years after Auschwitz was liberated, to understand that people's connection to the land can be expressed in saying grace after meals from a Jewish Shiddur, and it's been that way for thousands of years. It's all about the land. To understand these things is to understand that a Jewish person and the land of Israel are united. There's a connection there that transcends this conflict by thousands of years, and there's a connection there that transcends modern identities by thousands of years. And so, yes, Israel propaganda, if we're defining it as an unwaverable connection between Jews and Israel, that those stories should be told. And I don't think that those stories have to acknowledge this conflict. I think that there is a very valid way to talk about the Jewish story from its ancient origins to today, and how Israel fits in the modern state of Israel, as well as the ancient kingdoms of Israel and everything in between and in the diaspora, that doesn't need to acknowledge this conflict. So that's my short answer of, great, let's have that version of Israel propaganda there. I want to see more of those stories. Now, as far as the sort of more contextually appropriate answer to your question, I think that, you know, if you really watch this series and you come away with this being Israel propaganda, then it would be shocking to me, because the idea here was to take the worst accusations made against Israel and to put them front and center. Zionism is colonialism. Zionism is anti-progressive. Israel expelled Palestinians. Israel is an occupying force. Israel is an apartheid state. We literally, those are the titles of the videos, you know, in a question. And to say, wait a minute, how did we get to that assumption? How did that talking point become, you know, something to write on a sign on a quad? And what is the history that led to that point? And so to acknowledge the accusation without, you know, without contextualizing the history, it's almost impossible. So it really is the anti-propaganda series, because we're looking at these things people are saying about Israel, and we're saying, here's why they're saying them. Here's the kernel of truth. Here's the sort of the reason why saying this is not just seen as absurd in the public eye. And then here's all the historical context to give you the full picture why. And I think what we've done a good job of is saying, when you have that full picture, you would probably think it's a bit extreme and absurd to make those accusations or to listen to them without feeling obligated to reply.
Ariel, this has been wonderful. I'm sorry that we don't get to have more time.